Welcome to the Dairy News and Views podcast, a production of the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. Our podcast covers current educational, research, and industry tools available for your operation to manage healthy cows and calves while producing the highest quality dairy products. Thanks for joining us today on Dairy News and Views from the ISU Extension Dairy Team. I'm Jen Bentley, Northeast Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, and I'm here with our Extension Dairy Team. So we have everybody on the call here today. Fred Hall, our Northwest Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, Dr. Gail Carpenter, who's our State Extension Specialist, Larry Tranel, our Northeast Southeast Dairy Field Specialist, and Dr. Phil Jardin, our Extension Veterinarian, who we all were on the road together the last couple of weeks. And so we wanted to recap some of our discussions that we've had on our dairy days. And so I want to welcome the group back to the podcast.
Good to be here.
It's always great to be here, Jen.
Yep. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you, Jen.
Yeah, this is one of my busiest, but one of my favorite times of year when we get to do dairy days. It's a fun time to get to go all over the state and see some of the dairy producers that we don't always get to see. Just touch base with everybody on the topic of the year. So always look forward to this time of year and always interested to see what the weather's gonna turn out like too. So I think we actually went from we had a low of almost 45 and a high in the 40s over the 2.5 weeks that we were doing this. So definitely some adventures on the roads. Not all of us were able to make it to everyone, but that's the fun part of having a team, is that we can kind of pass things back and forth and take over for each other. So this was I believe my third dairy days. Philip, this was your first dairy days. What did you think?
I thought that was great. It was a great couple of weeks. The conversations were great during the sessions. And then afterwards, Gail took us, each one, we stopped at the local locker to get the local meat sticks. Very good.
Yeah, Gail, I think this is my 24th one, so I guess I never get sick of them. They're always kind of an exciting time for me to come back to, and see the producers and talk to them. And usually get a few farm visits after the fact of some of the things that we brought up. So it's always a good time.
What about you, Fred?
The conversations are always pretty incredible. Producers hear a certain point, and then when they want to talk about it, especially with calves, calf health, I think that made for some really interesting conversations. And like Larry said, the phone calls afterwards always pretty good. So, now the question I have, obviously I didn't make every one of them, but who is your top meat stick place?
Well, I don't think we should pick a favorite because I think they were all fantastic. It's like picking a favorite child, right? You can't, or a favorite student. You're not supposed to do that. Although Larry says that he has favorites too, but no, I think I think the best part was they were all a little bit different and all had their own little flair. And it was just kind of a taste of Iowa. So I think the one that I want to shout out though is we went to one in Dyersville, West Linden, which I had never heard of before, but we asked some of our attendees. We said we want to go when we're in the when we're down that way, we want to stop in and see a meat locker. Where should we go? Because we didn't know where to go. And somebody said, well, you have to check out West Linden. And I'd never heard of them before. And Google Maps took me there, but I was not sure it was taking me to the right spot because it's right in the middle of like kind of a residential neighborhood. And but sure enough, there was a little meat locker there. So they don't take credit cards, but if you have cash or check, you can get some pretty delicious meat sticks, and they are huge. They're a lot bigger than the ones that I bought at some of the other places. So good price too. Philip, did you pick a favorite, or you also prefer not to pick favorites?
Oh, that sounds like a political nightmare to me. They were all good.
Well, was there a flavor that you hadn't had before that really stuck out as being unique?
Well, I'd never tried the pork sticks at Edgewood before. So I think I got I forget the flavor, but I got one of their pork sticks. And I'd always gotten beef sticks before, so that was delicious. Highly recommend.
Well, it sounds
Of
like
cour-
Fred and Larry, next time we need to do some out and about travels, maybe ice cream, I think, right? Ice
There you
cream and
go. Yeah.
cheese. Okay,
Well,
Yep.
in Kelowna, it really wasn't a locker. It was the creamery.
that's right.
But there were,
That's kind
but
of a
there,
staple. Yep.
And
But
we
there
did
were
get the
meat
ice
sticks.
cream bars there, so.
yeah, yeah.
Go
Let's
ahead,
talk
Gail.
about what we're here to talk about. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I was just gonna say, last year we had dairy days and we focused on heifers. And we had really good response, good discussion, talking about different topics within heifers. And so with our RME grants, we decided that we would continue that discussion. And I think we kind of hit it on the head. People are very in tune with the topics. We talked about colostrum management, and that's been around for a long time, it seems. I think I've given that talk many years, but it always seems like there's something new to learn, especially as we add the different cues to our 5 cues of colostrum management. And I know, Phil, you're looking for a cue for temperature, and I don't think we found one yet, did we?
We did not yet. Nope.
But you
Well,
kind of want to cover what we went over with colostrum. Well, colostrum cleanliness was in particular, but we kind of hit all the colostrum management topics. You want to talk about a little bit what we did there?
Well, I was really glad to have the really good connection with the dairymen in the room for the discussions, and some people from industry too, that really added to their conversation. But we talked about the 5 Qs, which are quality, making sure that there's enough antibodies in the colostrum. So ways to test that. And I really want to give a shout out here to the Misco company for donating 2 refractometers to us, one to use for demonstration and one to use as a raffle prize. And then quantity, we want to make sure calves get a gallon of colostrum. At least Holstein calves should get a gallon of colostrum. And then quickness, and I really like Jen's slide on that, which she has a creation of a slide that shows that when a calf's born, they have about 35% absorption of the antibodies. So it's not 100%, like a lot of people think. It's still only 30, about a third. But then by 24 hours, it's pretty much down to none. So we want to make sure that gets in there very quickly, within a few hours of birth. And then I spent quite a bit of time on cleanliness. Like, it's really important to have clean colostrum. And colostrum needs to get cold very quickly, or the bacteria start to grow. And it's bad for several reasons. It keeps the antibodies from being absorbed, but it can make those calves very sick too. And then we talked about some ways to quantify it, with using a refractometer to check the blood for total protein or Brix. And then the feeding temperature, which is more important. I just found out in my career it's probably more important than we ever thought. To have what we feed the calves, the temperature of the milk and the temperature of the colostrum should be right around cow temperature. If it gets down in the 80s or up above the 100 and teens, it's probably too cold and too hot there. So, and I really appreciated Jen being my co-presenter on that. I thought we tag team that pretty well. It's kind of fun.
Yeah, I think people really enjoyed the hands-on part of it, getting to practice using some of those tools and really, just asking some good questions. And I think there's a lot of takeaways from, they can be creative on cooling colostrum, right? It doesn't have to be one set way, but think of some creative ways that you can get that colostrum cooled and take note of what the temperature is when you're trying to cool it or freeze it, thaw it,
Yep.
and get it fed to the calf.
And then we talked about heat treating it. We talked about heat treatment instead of pasteurization because we only heat it to 140 degrees for an hour rather than 145 degrees for 30 minutes, which is what the PMO would say to do for pasteurized milk. Because Sandra Godden at the University of Minnesota showed that if you heat it too hot, you'll destroy the antibodies. But you can heat it to 140 fairly safely without destroying anything.
I've heard Jen and Philip both talk about this topic a lot before, and I didn't think I was gonna necessarily learn anything new, but it was really still, I really enjoyed hearing you guys kind of to break that apart and talk about colostrum and some of the best practices, and it got me thinking fresh about some of the things that we get complacent about sometimes. So I think the temperature was the one that really stuck out to me that we don't maybe emphasize as much, and you guys convinced me that we should.
Yeah, I think we should treat colostrum just like we treat the milk we're going to sell for humans.
Mm-hmm.
When the milk we're gonna sell for humans comes out of the cow, goes through a pipeline through a plate cooler. And within just a couple minutes, it goes from cow temperature down to less than 40 degrees. And we should do that same with the colostrum. We tend to, put it in a 5-gallon bucket, leave it in the breezeway for an hour, then put it in the refrigerator where it gets cold really slowly. Which sometimes in my career was a real eye opener how slowly things get cold in the refrigerator. And I think it's really important that we don't just count on a refrigerator to get things cold. Find another system, either a plate cooler or put it in a freezer in flat bags or some other way to get the colostrum really cold, because bacteria grows really quickly in it.
Yeah, and I think that led really nicely, Gail, into your topic as we talk about heifer growth and, looking at what that growth is like from growing phase to breeding to age at first calving. So you want to talk a little bit about your presentation. It was called Lessons Learned and Path Forward.
Yeah, so Jen and I spent a fair amount of time this past fall going around and measuring heifers for folks, and we're still willing to do that again in the spring if anybody's hearing us talking now and wants to get us out there to benchmark some of their heifer growth and development. But yeah, just I guess maybe taking a step back as to why we did this whole topic in the first place. A lot of it is because, as Larry's going to talk about here in a sec, heifers are a costly part of a lot of dairies, and I think people don't always appreciate how much investment goes into heifers, and we want to make sure, those are the foundation of your future herd, right? And we want to make sure that we're getting the most out of what we invest in them. So the first, and I enjoyed my talk because it's my talk, but also because it did tie in, I think, pretty well with some of the other topics. So like I mentioned, Larry's going to talk here about the cost of heifer growth and development, but another thing that we think about when we're talking about trying to reduce those heifer costs, I think a lot of times we go to things like, well, let's lower our age at first calving, or let's lower our input costs, and how can we save on different aspects of heifer growth and development. But a big one that I think would save a lot of people some money is just growing the right amount of heifers and making sure that we don't have too many heifers, but that we also aren't too short on heifers. And so it's a pretty complicated equation to decide what the correct number of heifers is for each herd. And it's definitely something that you can't just give a nice little quick rule of thumb and expect everybody and expect that to work for every herd. So Greg Pallas, who's not on today, but was from Dairy Records Management Systems, he also tagged along with us. He spent a lot of time in the car from Ames with me and Philip, and also got to experience the joy of Iowa lockers, but his talk was about a new suite of tools available through Dairy Records Management Systems, DRMS. So herds that are on test with DRMS or have PC Dart would have access to this suite of tools called Herd HQ. And one of those is Heifer Hub, which is a tool that can kind of help with that inventory management and determine for your herd what is the right number of heifers to create. And we know there's a few strategies around that. So you can use sex semen, you can use a combination of sexed and conventional, or sexed and beef semen, and more we see less use for conventional semen in the industry, and a lot of people relying on sexed and beef. So I believe we have I-29, our sister organization, or an organization that we're a part of. Greg did a webinar for them a few months ago now, and did he do a podcast too, Fred, or just a webinar?
Yes, he did both the webinar and the podcast.
So if you want to learn more about that, you can feel free to visit our I-29 Moo University channels and dig those up. So encourage you to check those out. But after we create the right number of heifers on herd, we want to make sure that we're growing those heifers well to first calving. So we want to target them reaching 80 to 85% of their mature body weight at first calving. And so it's important not just to measure your heifers, but also your mature cows, and make sure that you're hitting that target. We also talked in my presentation about making sure that we're limiting variation and not just hitting the average, but limiting our variation in age at first calving. And part of that can be, for a lot of herds, investing in making sure that conception rate for their heifers is optimum. So this can be using heat sink protocols in our heifers, or using some sort of activity monitoring system. And one of the things that I focused on in my talk is just thinking about the small changes you can make in your herd to start doing a better job with your heifers. And I don't think we I don't think every herd's going to need to reinvent the wheel. And even if you have, sometimes that can make it harder to make the first step, right? If you think my heifers are really struggling, I have to make a whole bunch of changes all at once, that can be pretty overwhelming. And so one of the things I focus on quite a bit in my talk is just making sure that we're making those small steps in the right direction for our heifers. So weigh tapes can be a great tool on a lot of herds to kind of get some estimates of those body weights. And there's something that can be pretty easy to incorporate into what you're already doing on farm. So if you're breeding heifers, throw a weigh tape around them. If you're weaning heifers, throw them on a scale. If you have your first lactation cows calving in, throw a weigh tape around them. Weigh tapes aren't perfect, and I think we've seen that they're not necessarily perfect, but they're a great step in the right direction, and they're a low cost opportunity for a lot of farms, and something that's pretty easy to implement. So then the last thing I want to emphasize from my talk is making sure that you're using the data that you collect, and if you ever want help analyzing your data or talking about the stuff that you've been collecting, you can always feel free to reach out to us at dairyextension@iastate.edu, and we would love to help you figure out what to do. If you've been, writing your data down in a notebook somewhere or putting it in your computer, but you don't know what to do with it, we'd love to help you figure out what to do with it.
And we also gave away some weigh tapes during Dairy Day. So at each location, I think we gave away 4 or 5 weigh
Yeah.
tapes to people that, just a tool in the right direction that you can start using it. However, if you want to weigh wean calves, heifers, just to kind of get you started, and hopefully we hear some feedback on those people that received those.
Yeah.
With our focus on dairy heifers, we just in the last week or so, we've had USDA release some numbers that I find fascinating. Dairy heifer inventories have declined for 6 straight years. And, the agency that keeps track of this says, we've had 8.3 fewer heifers than the previous year. That makes the 4.059 million dairy heifers the lowest inventory we've had in 20 years. So as Larry talks about evaluating the cost on your farm, it's good to remember that, they're becoming very, very valuable. And the fact is, we still have to have enough of them to keep a herd at the right size. So, Larry, I kind of keyed you up there a little bit.
Yeah, I appreciate. Yeah, you're definitely right there. Yeah, they definitely have a lot of value. And I think what Gail says is the balance of the how many heifers you really need. But I think the thing that really struck me, even just putting the presentation together, was just the inflation cost of what we thought. Like, especially as Jen helped me with the wet heifer calf analysis. And basically that has almost doubled just the cost of raising the wet calf in the last 8 to 10 years, I would tend to say, because it used to be in that $350 range back in the 2013-15 time frame, and now we're probably in that $6 range, and you can give or take $1 nowadays. So there's probably some that are probably costing $7 a day. Some might be doing as cheap as $5 a day. When they take a look at how they use their waste milk and other strategies that can use to try to reduce that cost. But I think the wet calf cost is probably something that people don't realize how expensive that is to raise those wet calves. And as that goes into that budget, it gets pretty important to the whole overall cost of raising the heifers. And so when we take a look at the cost of raising those heifers, I mean, just like for an average dairy herd in a conventional type system, I mean, for a heifer to actually cost, and this is with the initial value of the calf, say about $225. I mean, it's not too far fetched for this to be running at $2,500 to $2,600. But I think in Iowa, we also need to realize that there's just a lot of different systems of how people raise heifers, how they milk cows. With the Iowa dairy budgets, we've got 17 different budgets in those Iowa dairy budgets, and that probably doesn't even start to begin the number of systems that we might actually have out there. And so I think some of the lowest cost systems might be raising heifers for $2,000 to $2,200, and a few might do it even a little bit cheaper than that. But it is not far fetched for the average cost of a heifer to actually be in that $2,600. And so the balance comes in where Gail's mentioning the balance. I mean, the balance comes in is why raise those extra heifers unless they're very high genetic heifers and they're going to sell for a high genetic value. compared to what the market might be. And Fred, maybe you could help out what the current market is out there in the Northwest, because that's one that we trail quite, because a lot of those heifers from all over seem like they end up out in the Northwest in your territory there. But if you're raising them or selling them for 1,800 or 2,000, even 2,200, but it's costing you 2,600, then yeah, that balances why raise those extra heifers that you don't need. So I think overall, just when you take a look at the systems of raising pastures, raising heifers, especially on pasture, we can probably reduce the cost there sometimes $300 to $400 just by having a pasture raised animal, which actually give us more longevity, some health benefits, and also some increased milk production. Believe it or not, when those heifers hit the milking strengths, there's definitely some advantages to do something like that, but it's not always the most fun if you got cattle out or the electric fence isn't working or something like that, or you have working in the rain or the mud. So there's definitely some drawbacks to raising them on there. But I think as we take a look at the benchmarks, I always just go back to those benchmarks, so that those heifers should be doubling their birth weight from the day they're born at age 56, and in those early days of their life that they're growing some cells in their udders, that if they don't grow them within the first 45, 50 days, they're probably not going to grow them. And so it's going to cost you in milk production when they hit their milking string as well. And the same thing that kind of a pet peeve, I guess, from my presentation last year is that Peter Pan problem, where these heifers, sometimes we're getting them bred too early and they never really get a chance to grow up. And after they have that first calf, they're not going to make up what they could have made up if they were just at the better stage of growth before they actually were bred the first time. So I think those were just some of the highlights that I kind of remember from my presentation that I thought I'd share.
And Larry, kind of going back to the wet calf analysis, we did have quite a bit of discussion at the locations, just talking about, yeah, it did cost $3 or $4 a day to raise a calf, but we've also increased the amount of powder that we're feeding our calves too, to get the growth now. And so that's led to some increased cost. We've also implemented automatic calf feeders, so we know that's kind of a higher investment cost. But again, kind of going back to the return of, if we can feed these calves higher plane of nutrition, whether that's just through higher protein in the milk or, multiple feedings throughout the day, what is that return in the milking string? So I think that was quite a bit of discussion on the wet calf side of those costs.
Yeah, I think that's important to realize, though. It's not just inflation that's driven up those costs, even though inflation has been pretty dramatic here, especially the last few years, but definitely has been a lot of other things like the plane of nutrition and just trying to get the additional growth rate. So great points, Jen.
Well, as we wrap up here, any other last comments about Dairy Days?
I just want to thank all the producers that came. It was great to meet them and have great conversations. And it was also great to see the diversity of ages. I think we had from 2 to 80 probably.
Yeah. We didn't ask everybody their ages, so don't let that hold you back from attending in future years. It's not a requirement to tell us your age. But yeah, we did meet a lot of new folks and see a lot of familiar faces, and it was kind of fun to learn new things about our colleagues. I learned that Philip's a pretty avid wordler, so so yeah, something we have in common.
And I would say, for upcoming Dairy Days, if people have topics that they want to hear about, that you want us to focus on, we always look for that feedback from our producers and industry. I know we took some comments back from our evaluations, but you can always email us at dairyextension@iastate.edu, or you can talk to us individually if you have any questions about anything that we talked about here on the podcast here today. And so we look forward to visiting with you on the next Dairy News and Views from ISU. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye now.
This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or combination inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/EXT.